Sophie Bennett's earliest memories tasted of dew-soaked grass and the crackling laughter of two families so intertwined their lives seemed indistinguishable. Surrey, England, a village swaddled in ivy-wrapped cottages and quiet, winding lanes, was their playground. Her world began in the garden of Willow House, where her father's larger-than-life presence loomed like an oak tree, constant and reassuring. Across the low stone wall stood the grander estate of the Sterlings, where young Alex Sterling reigned as her twin in spirit, if not in blood. From the moment Sophie learned to walk, Alex was at her side. Summers passed with their hair tangled by wind as they raced bicycles down the cobbled lanes, past hedgerows bursting with blooms. Winters meant building snow forts under the watchful gaze of their mothers, who drank tea from delicate china and laughed like old friends. Though, even then, Claudia Bennett's laugh was brittle, distracted, as though something better awaited elsewhere. Their fathers, Thomas Bennett and Charles Sterling, had met at Sterling University decades before, their bond sealed by shared ambition and endless bottles of whiskey. Together, they built fortunes that allowed their children to live carefree lives. Weekend dinners rotated predictably. Friday nights at Willow House with Thomas's robust roasts and generous pours. Saturday luncheons at the Sterlings' elegant dining hall, where Alex's mother, Eleanor Sterling, presided with grace and affection. For Sophie, her father was everything. He delighted in her curiosity, praised her sketches, and carried her on his shoulders through the village fair. If Claudia noticed her daughter's hunger for affection, she didn't show it. Even during this idyllic time, Claudia kept a distance, always impeccably dressed, always glancing at her watch, always slightly elsewhere. Alex's world, by contrast, revolved around Eleanor. A woman of rare beauty and warmth, Eleanor had a laugh that made even the local vicar pause, a touch that soothed Alex when he scraped his knees or failed a spelling test. To Sophie, Eleanor was almost a second mother, gentler, softer, a source of quiet stability. Their lives seemed perfect, until the winter of 2014. That December evening began like many others, a dinner at Willow House. Two families gathered under the warm glow of chandeliers, crystal glasses chiming, fireplaces crackling. Sophie, 12 and already showing hints of the guarded independence that would define her later, watched her father closely that night. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he drank more than usual. Alex, nearly 13, and suddenly lanky and self-conscious, teased her gently about her sketchbook under the table. They laughed together in whispers, their childhood ease intact. Then something shifted. A raised voice, Claudia's, sharp and cutting, a slammed door, an awkward pause among the adults that froze the children in place. Sophie remembered the look in her father's eyes when he followed Claudia down the hall, the set of his jaw tight with barely contained fury. She remembered Alex's mother exchanging a glance with Charles Sterling, a silent warning that Sophie would understand only later. The details of that night blurred afterward, but the consequence was crystalline. Something unspeakable occurred in the shadows of Willow House. A door creaked open at just the wrong moment, a misunderstanding, or perhaps not. Sophie's accusation rang out before midnight, and its echo tore two families apart. In the following days, gossip bloomed across Surrey like frost on the fields. The Bennetts' marriage dissolved in scandal, and Claudia wasted no time whisking Sophie to London, severing ties without ceremony. For Alex, the devastation was quieter, but no less complete. Eleanor Sterling, whose illness had been a closely guarded secret, deteriorated rapidly under the weight of grief. She died before spring thawed the countryside. Sophie wrote letters, pages filled with sorrow, confusion, pleas for forgiveness, but Alex never replied. His silence was a wall she could not scale. Where once she had found joy in their shared world, now there was silence. The village streets that had echoed with their laughter became haunted pathways Sophie would never walk again. Her last sight of Alex Sterling came the morning her mother forced her into a waiting car bound for Kensington. He stood on the edge of their adjoining gardens, his face unreadable, a boy in mourning armor. His shoulders squared in defiance as he watched the car pull away. But he did not wave. He did not look away. In that moment, something inside Sophie hardened. The warmth that had defined her childhood began to calcify into the cold reserve she would carry through the next 8 years. She vowed never again to trust, never again to expose herself to such vulnerability. The girl who left Surrey in the back seat of her mother's car was no longer the carefree child of two families entwined by history and affection. She became, instead, a quiet observer of her own life, watchful, self-contained, and determined to control what little she could. Her father did not write. Her childhood friends disappeared like mist. Only memories remained, ghosts she carried alone. London was louder than Surrey, coarser, faster, colder. But inside the Kensington townhouse where Sophie now lived, a different kind of cold reigned. Silence and polished surfaces that gleamed but reflected nothing back. Claudia Bennett wasted no time recreating herself after Surrey, sliding into a new marriage with Richard Bennett, a man whose charm was polished to a mirror's sheen, but whose gaze lingered on Sophie too long, too often. In those first months, Sophie learned to disappear in plain sight. She kept her head down at her new school, excelling without drawing attention. At home, she navigated Claudia's sharp disinterest and Richard's slick condescension, quietly mastering the art of survival. Her bedroom, neat, sparse, sterile, became her only sanctuary. There were no remnants of Willow House here, no childhood photos, no evidence she had ever belonged anywhere except this pristine cage. But it was not just physical exile she endured. Thomas Bennett had vanished, not only from Surrey, but from her life entirely. No calls, no letters. His absence weighed heavier than Claudia's cruelty. Sophie, once adored, was now an inconvenience. A duty Claudia resented but could not shed until the right opportunity presented itself. Then, in 2018, Oliver arrived. Sophie remembered the day vividly. Claudia's pregnancy had been a reluctant announcement, more a transaction than celebration, and Richard paraded around the impending girth like it was a branding exercise. But when Oliver was placed into Claudia's disinterested arms and Richard's attention quickly waned, it was Sophie who took that small, vulnerable life into hers. At first, she kept her distance, unsure, guarded. But the child's simple need for care pierced her carefully built armor. His cries drew her from her solitude, his small fists clinging to her shirt when Claudia left him unattended for hours. The bond was slow, but inexorable. She became his surrogate mother before she realized it. In Oliver's laugh, there were echoes of a time before bitterness consumed her. He reached for her hair, for her face, for her presence, and she gave herself to him completely. It was an unspoken promise. She would protect him no matter the cost. If she had failed to save her childhood, she would not fail to save his. By the time Oliver could toddle after her through the cavernous townhouse halls, Sophie's purpose was clear. She studied relentlessly, perfecting her craft in textile and fashion design, a world she could control, where precision and detail mattered, and where approval did not hinge on fragile family dynamics. Her designs reflected her temperament. Elegant, exacting, beautiful, but distant. Fabric bent to her will when people would not. She entered university in London at 18, determined, private, and utterly self-sufficient. She allowed no close friendships. Classmates admired her work but knew little of the girl behind the portfolio. She did not date. She did not entertain gossip. Every choice she made served a singular purpose: independence. It was not ambition for its own sake that drove her, but the quiet plan she nursed with near religious discipline: graduate at the top of her class,
establish herself professionally, gain financial independence, and then, when she had built an unassailable foundation, petition for custody of Oliver. She would rescue him from this toxic household before Richard's veiled attentions darkened further, or Claudia's apathy consumed him entirely. Her life narrowed into this goal. Every evening, she returned from university to Kensington, slipping into Oliver's nursery before anyone noticed she was home. She read to him, fed him, held him as he fell asleep, his small hands curled into her cardigan as though afraid she might vanish. During those late hours, she would watch him breathe and feel a strange ache, half love, half sorrow. He was her refuge, even as he was her reason for enduring. No one else knew the weight she carried. No one else would understand. Years passed. The townhouse remained as pristine and joyless as ever. Claudia grew colder, retreating into wine and cosmetic treatments. Richard's smiles remained too wide, his compliments too slick. But Sophie became steel, cold, resilient, unbreakable. Then, in the summer of 2022, everything shifted. The letter arrived without fanfare, a thick cream envelope bearing an ornate crest she recognized instantly. Sterling University. She read the letter twice, 3 times, certain it was some mistake. She had never applied. She had no desire to return to that corner of England or the ghosts it housed. But there it was, a formal transfer offer to join Sterling as a third-year student, an offer too generous to refuse on paper, yet too sinister to accept without suspicion. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she turned the envelope over. There, in the flourish of the signature at the bottom, she saw it. Her father's unmistakable handwriting. He had orchestrated this. Not a kind invitation, but a summons. After all these years of absence, he moved from the shadows to pull her back into his world. Into Alex Sterling's world.
Claudia's reaction was swift and sharp-edged. The offer was a gift to her, a perfect solution to a long-standing inconvenience. "You'll go, of course," Claudia said that evening, swirling a glass of red wine lazily. "A place like Sterling University will open doors even for a girl like you." Richard's smirk was sharper. "A fresh start, Sophie. Perhaps this is exactly what you need." But Sophie saw the truth in their eagerness. They wanted her gone. They wanted the space she occupied, the problem she represented, to vanish neatly into the walls of a university on a wind-swept cliff. For a moment, she considered defiance, refusal. But then she thought of Oliver, alone in this house with them. If she could graduate sooner, if she could secure a future faster, she could return for him stronger, sooner. So she booked the ticket, a one-way journey back to the place where it had all begun and where it had all ended. She packed quietly. No goodbyes were exchanged. Oliver cried when she kissed his forehead for the last time before dawn, too young to understand why she was leaving, too innocent to know she did not want to. As the train pulled out of London Victoria, Sophie kept her face impassive. But inside, she was a quiet storm of grief, bitterness, fear, and resolve. The cold sea air of Sterling awaited her. So did the bitter ghost of a boy she once called her best friend. Sophie Bennett was going back. Not as a child, not as a victim, but as a woman forged in loss, betrayal, and determination. And nothing, not Alex Sterling, not her estranged father, not the shadows of that tragic winter, would stop her from finishing what she had started. The journey from London to the coast felt endless, though Sophie hardly moved a muscle as the train rattled on. Her face was still, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, but inside her mind raced with thoughts she could not silence. Every mile that drew her closer to Sterling University felt heavier than the last. The name itself clung to her skin like a chill. Sterling. Once the site of her happiest days, then the graveyard of her childhood. When she finally stepped off the coach that carried her from the small station to the university's gates, the wind hit her at once, brisk, salt-laced, and sharp. It swept through her coat, catching at the loose strands of her hair as if to remind her where she stood. The cliffs loomed beyond the iron gates, gray and weathered, with the sea crashing far below. Ahead, the university rose like something carved from another age. Towering stone walls, slate rooftops, ivy creeping up every surface. Beautiful, imposing, cold. She paused for a moment just outside the entrance arch, her suitcase handle gripped tightly in her hand. The students around her paid her no mind, some bustling past with laughter, some walking in elegant clusters, scarves draped just so, heads inclined in gossip. Her chest ached, though she refused to show it. Sterling University was humming with life, life she did not expect to welcome her back. As she walked slowly along the main path, Sophie absorbed every detail. The grandeur was undeniable. Wide stone steps leading up to grand oak doors, manicured lawns where students lounged in clusters, the faint sound of string music coming from an open window somewhere high above. But beneath it all was an undercurrent, a culture built on history, privilege, and the weight of old names. Names like Sterling. Her arrival was late in the term. She knew what that meant even before she saw the glances. Curiosity sharpened into whispers, eyes flicking in her direction, half-suppressed smiles. The girl who transferred mid-year. Unheard of. And then, once they learned her name, once they connected the dots, she could already imagine the whispers turning to something far more vicious. Her room was tucked high up in one of the older halls, a narrow space with a window that looked directly over the cliffs and out onto the restless sea. The room was sparse but perfectly kept, an iron bedstead, polished wooden floors, heavy curtains in the university colors. It smelled faintly of lavender polish and sea air. Sophie set down her suitcase with care and sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, long and slow. This was it, the place where she would make her stand, where she would earn her independence, where she would carve out a future for Oliver. Her thoughts sharply turned to her half-brother, his soft hair beneath her fingers, his small hand gripping hers whenever she read to him. She clenched her jaw. She couldn't let herself fall apart. She had a purpose here. The next morning came quickly, and so did the weight of it all. Sterling University during term was a living thing, a swirl of voices, footsteps on flagstones, laughter in alcoves, and gossip exchanged over china cups in the grand common rooms. The return from summer had brought them all back. The golden children of old families, polished and poised, carrying themselves with the ease that came from generations of entitlement. Sophie kept her steps steady, her posture composed. She could feel their eyes even before they spoke. Low comments just out of earshot, smiles that didn't reach eyes, careful assessments as she passed. Every corridor was a test of her self-control. She was determined. No reaction, no cracks. Her lectures and tutorials were held in rooms lined with oak paneling and portraits of old scholars staring down with haughty detachment. Even the tutors themselves carried an air of quiet expectation, one that seemed to assume every student in the room had come from a family that had dined here for centuries. The air around campus felt heavy with wealth, tradition, and something darker, gossip. Sophie caught hints of it everywhere she went, even as she kept to herself. Her name was already circulating, and she knew why. And yet, strangely, she did not see him, Alex Sterling. His name hovered over everything here. His family's name was on the gates carved into the walls, whispered with a sort of reverence. She could feel his presence without ever glimpsing his face. The students who held court in the courtyards and lounges spoke of him with casual awe, mentioning him in passing as if he were part of the very stone. But he had not appeared, not yet. Her first few days passed in this strange limbo, her determination to stay unnoticed failing, but his absence unsettling. She sensed something, almost as if he was letting the tension build, letting her feel the weight of his world before stepping into it. On her third evening, walking back from the library, she paused outside the main dining hall. The doors were thrown open, and inside, laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the night air. Gold and silver light flickered from chandeliers. She glimpsed them all, the students who would shape the culture here, lounging with wine and effortless cruelty. Somewhere in that crowd, she knew, was Alex Sterling, and he would not remain distant for long. The wind whipped around her shoulders as she turned away, steeling herself once more. Let them whisper. Let them stare. She had not come here for their approval. Sophie Bennett had come to endure and to win. It was only Sophie's third day at Sterling University, but already she could feel the eyes on her everywhere she went. The grand dining hall smelled of oak and fresh polish, humming with the return of students who carried themselves like they owned every stone in the place. Long, polished tables stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Chandeliers flickered above, casting golden light that caught the silverware in sharp glints. This wasn't home. It never had been. She moved carefully along the service line, tray in hand. An omelet, 2 slices of toast, and a cup of tea balanced neatly, just as she liked it. She planned to sit alone, stay quiet, avoid attention. But it was already too late for that. A group of girls near the entrance leaned in, whispering behind their hands, deliberately loud enough. "That's the new girl, isn't it? Sophie Bennett." "Yeah, the one from London. Posh, but cold, apparently." Their words bounced off her carefully constructed silence. She didn't so much as turn her head. Further into the hall, at the prime table by the tall windows where the sea view was best, sat Alex Sterling. Alex didn't just belong here, he ruled it. His name was carved into these walls by generations before him, and his presence was magnetic. The girls around him laughed too loudly, flicking their hair as if competing for his attention. The boys flanking him looked for his approval without even realizing they did it. Alex himself was dressed with effortless precision, dark blazer, open collar, cufflinks gleaming just enough, and his hair falling across his forehead just so. He was relaxed, half listening to a conversation about the upcoming welcome party, until he noticed her. His gaze lifted, caught her mid-step. For a breath, everything in him stilled. 8 years. 8 years since Sophie Bennett's accusation had destroyed his family, since he had sat at his mother's bedside, holding her hand as she faded, blaming Sophie for every tortured breath. The calm in his face hardened immediately. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the stem of his wine glass. "All right, mate?" one of his friends nudged, noticing the sudden change in him. Alex stood slowly, the scrape of his chair deliberate. The chatter around them softened as more heads turned to see what had caught his attention. Sophie hadn't even seen him yet. She was heading for a quiet corner table, moving as if this was just another ordinary lunch. It infuriated him. The air around him changed as he stepped forward, weaving past chairs and students without hesitation, until he was right there, standing directly in her path. Sophie stopped abruptly, her eyes lifting to meet his. There was no shock in her gaze, no fluster, just calm, cool, impossibly steady. The atmosphere shifted around them instantly. Conversations at nearby tables dropped into silence, curiosity thick in the air. For a long moment, neither said a word. Then Alex spoke, his voice pitched just low enough to seem casual, but loud enough that half the room would hear every syllable. "Well, well, Sterling University has finally let in the traitor." His words sliced clean and sharp, and the tension snapped across the room like an electric current. Sophie didn't waver. Her lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," she said coolly, voice soft but steady. "You're in my way." That simple sentence poured fuel into his fire. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't humbled. She wasn't even acknowledging what she'd done. He let a dark smile curl his lips, leaning in slightly, so his next words could carry to the eager ears nearby. "Sorry, love. I'm not interested in following you to the toilets for a bit of fun, all right? You can stop chasing me around." A gasp swept through the surrounding tables. A few boys laughed immediately, short, cruel bursts. Some girls smirked, others shot glances at Sophie that said everything: judgment, amusement, curiosity. In one stroke, Alex had shifted the narrative. The rumor would spread before the lunch hour was over. The new girl offered Alex Sterling sex in the bathroom, and he rejected her. But Sophie didn't react. Her stomach twisted inside, yes, but her face remained smooth, her eyes steady. She didn't give him the satisfaction of anger or shame. Deliberately, she set her tray down on the nearest table and turned to face him properly. Without raising her voice, she replied evenly, a touch of quiet disdain coloring her tone. "You've overestimated yourself, Sterling. If I wanted something cheap, there are plenty of desperate boys here I could ask." A sharp ripple of shock moved through the hall again. Someone at the far end let out a soft whistle. A few girls exchanged startled looks, while some of Alex's own friends straightened uneasily. His smile faltered for a brief, flickering second before hardening again. But Sophie saw it. She saw the crack beneath the mask. His gaze darkened dangerously, hate sharper now, colder, but beneath it, something far more dangerous simmered. A heat he couldn't entirely conceal. A tension neither of them wanted but couldn't escape. Alex stepped in closer, closer than polite, closer than casual, until the space between them was almost nothing. This time, his voice dropped lower, meant only for her. "Careful, Bennett. You might pretend you don't care, but I know exactly how to break you. I want you gone by the weekend." His breath was cool against her cheek as he spoke, too close, too intimate for someone who supposedly hated her. But Sophie, as ever, held steady. She lifted her chin slightly, looking him directly in the eye. "That's your problem, Sterling," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Her words weren't shouted. There was no scene, just pure, collected defiance. Then she picked up her tray again, smooth, graceful, and walked past him as though he was nothing more than another spoiled boy in a room full of them. Around them, the dining hall buzzed back to life, but the balance had shifted. Alex's friends muttered, exchanging looks, some amused, some uncertain. But Alex himself didn't move immediately. He stayed standing there, watching Sophie's back as she crossed the hall and sat neatly at a small table in the far corner. Her posture was perfect, her attention focused on cutting into her omelet as if none of this had happened. But he knew better. He could feel the pulse of her heart even from across the room. And worse, much worse, he could feel his own. Hatred. That's what this was. Pure, blinding hatred. But underneath that hatred ran something else entirely. A dangerous pull that he despised almost as much as he despised her. Alex Sterling sat down slowly, fury thrumming in his veins. This was only the beginning. He would break Sophie Bennett. He would make sure of it. The sun was sinking low by the time Sophie left the library, the sky streaked with soft gold and pale lavender. The stone path that wound around Sterling University's east courtyard felt colder than it had that morning. But the chill in the air wasn't only from the coming evening. Since that scene in the dining hall, Sophie could feel the shift everywhere she walked, gazes sliding sideways when she passed, whispers curling just out of reach. Some students smirked openly. Others just stared as though she were some curiosity they couldn't quite place. She hated it. She hated how effective Alex Sterling's cruelty had been. But even more than that, she hated the way her chest felt tight every time she replayed his words in her mind. She should have ignored them completely. She'd promised herself she would. But his voice, that calm, sharp way he delivered his humiliation, it clung to her skin like the sea air. And yet, even as she walked faster, books pressed tightly to her chest, head bowed slightly against the wind, her resolution stayed firm. She wasn't leaving. Not for him, not for the girls giggling behind their wine glasses, not for the whispers in the corridors, not for this university that had been built on families like his. Her breath caught as she reached the far end of campus, where the old iron gate creaked slightly in the breeze. She stopped. For a moment, she let herself rest, leaning back against the cold stone. She brushed hair from her face, fingers trembling just enough that she had to steady them deliberately. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the day. And then, his voice broke the quiet, smooth and unmistakable. "You're stubborn, Bennett. I'll give you that." Her eyes snapped open. Alex Sterling was there, leaning lazily against the gate as if the spot belonged to him too, arms folded, one leg crossed over the other, looking as casual as if they were old friends meeting by chance. But that smirk he wore? It was colder than before, harder. The Playboy charm stripped away until only something dangerous remained underneath. Sophie didn't move. She kept her back against the wall, forcing herself to meet his gaze evenly. "What do you want now, Sterling?" she asked flatly. Her tone was calm, too calm, as if she couldn't be bothered with whatever game he thought he was playing. Alex pushed off from the gate, straightening, taking a slow step towards her. Then another. The space between them shrank quickly. "There's no audience this time," he said, voice low but sharp. "So you can stop pretending you didn't care what happened earlier." Sophie's arms tightened around her books. "I'm not pretending anything. You staged your little show. Congratulations. I hope you feel powerful." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You think you won some little victory in the dining hall today?" he asked, leaning in just a fraction, enough that she could see the tension at the corners of his mouth. "This isn't over. Not even close." Sophie straightened, her spine against the stone now, but she wouldn't move, wouldn't let him see how much she wanted this conversation to end. "You're wasting your time," she said coolly. "You're obsessed with a girl from 8 years ago who doesn't even exist anymore." For a heartbeat, she thought she saw it. Something flicker behind his eyes. Hurt? Regret? But it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the armor he wore so perfectly. 8 years? He repeated, voice quieter now, more dangerous. "Do you think I forgot? You destroyed everything, Bennett. Everything." His words were cutting, but not loud, measured, almost like a confession disguised as accusation. Sophie's jaw set. "You think I didn't lose anything?" she shot back, her voice sharper now, cutting through the cool evening air like glass. "You don't know half of what I went through after that night." But he wasn't listening. Or maybe he didn't want to hear. His gaze was locked on her face, his expression unreadable, but burning with something bitter and raw. "You'll be gone by the weekend," he said again, soft but certain, as if saying it would make it true. His tone didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. His words were a promise. And then, without waiting for a reply, he turned sharply and walked away, disappearing down the path with that same effortless stride he carried everywhere he went. But he left something behind, a silence that felt almost heavier than his presence. Sophie stood perfectly still for a moment, heart racing. The humiliation in the dining hall had stung. But this felt different. This was personal, in a way that made her stomach twist. Not just cruelty for cruelty's sake. There was something else behind it. Hatred, yes, but history, too. And she wasn't sure which of them would break first. In another part of campus, Alex kept walking, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. His mind spun with thoughts he didn't want to examine. She should have left already. She should have packed her bags and disappeared. But no. Sophie Bennett stood there, calm and cold, meeting him word for word, gaze for gaze. She didn't cower. She didn't even tremble. And that infuriated him more than anything. She should have left, he muttered under his breath, walking faster, ignoring the curious glances of students he passed. She should have broken. Why the hell hasn't she? His jaw clenched as he replayed her words in his head, the way she'd accused him of being obsessed, the way she claimed the girl from 8 years ago no longer existed. But she was wrong. She was exactly the same. Or at least, that's what he told himself. He wasn't done. He wasn't even close to done. By the weekend, she would crack. He would make sure of it. The next morning at Sterling University dawned crisp and bright. But for Sophie, the brightness felt cruel. The moment she stepped into the lecture hall, she felt it. Heads turning, whispers sliding along rows, sniggers she couldn't quite catch but didn't need to. Her name. Her name was everywhere. "Did you hear?" one girl whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. She offered herself to Alex Sterling, in the bathroom, no less. A boy nearby chuckled, loud and deliberate. Poor thing must have thought she stood a chance. Sterling wouldn't touch that. Sophie kept walking, her gaze fixed ahead, her steps careful and quiet. Her chest was tight, but she wouldn't give them what they wanted. She took her usual seat near the back of the room, setting out her books precisely, ignoring the sideways glances from two girls who sat nearby, and immediately shifted their seats as if she carried some invisible disease. Even the lecturer, a man in his late 50s with an air of weary detachment, hesitated before calling her name on the attendance sheet, glancing up briefly, his gaze flicking to the corner where she sat alone, before moving on quickly. Sterling's name carried weight here, and so did Sterling's rumors. It followed her everywhere that day, from the halls where boys nudged one another as she passed, to the library where a pair of girls hissed her name and giggled as they pretended to study. By the time she reached the tennis courts for team tryouts that afternoon, her jaw ached from how tightly she'd kept it clenched. This she could control. Tennis had always been her refuge. The feel of the racket in her hand, the clean sound of a perfect serve, the steady rhythm of footwork. These things didn't care about gossip or old wounds. The coach, a wiry man with a clipped voice and sharp eyes, glanced down at his list as she approached. "Bennett," he said slowly. "Any relation to Richard Bennett?" His tone made her stomach twist, but she met his gaze evenly. "Stepdaughter," she replied simply. He grunted. "Well, let's see if you can play." And she could. She did. On that court, her body moved like a precision instrument, smooth, deliberate, calm, every stroke controlled, every point won without drama. The other girls, some clearly waiting for her to stumble, couldn't match her skill. Even the coach, cool and detached, had to nod in approval by the end. "You've got a spot," he said briskly. "Training starts next week." For a brief moment, something light flickered inside her, almost satisfaction. But it didn't last. As she gathered her things near the net, a voice rang out behind her. "Well, well, look at you, on the tennis team now. Impressive, for someone who apparently spends her evenings chasing Alex Sterling into bathrooms." The voice was unmistakable. Vicky Kensington. Vicky, all perfect hair, designer kit, and inherited arrogance, stood with her arms crossed, a small crowd gathered behind her. Her smile was cold. Honestly, Bennett, you're ambitious. I'll give you that. But you might want to save your energy. Alex isn't interested in charity. Laughter rippled around them. Sophie didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. But that silence worked against her. It made her look guilty, aloof, exactly as they wanted to paint her. Inside, she could feel her heart pounding, but outwardly, she remained still, methodical, calm. She packed up her racket carefully, gave Vicky a cool glance that wasn't quite a smile, and walked away. She wouldn't stoop to their level. But every step back to her room felt heavier. That evening, far from the tennis courts and common rooms, Alex sat alone in his quarters. His rooms were steeped in history. Carved wood paneling, old portraits, shelves lined with trophies he'd won over the years, books he never bothered to read now. And there, tucked away half forgotten, a small silver frame caught his eye. He reached for it without thinking. Inside the frame, an old photo. Himself and Sophie, 10 years old, muddy from the park, laughing as they posed with Eleanor Sterling standing behind them with one hand on each of their shoulders. He stared at it for a long time. He hadn't seen this photo in years. He'd buried it deep on that shelf like everything else from those days. From before the night that changed everything. Before Sophie had spoken words that tore his family apart. His mother's smile in that photo felt like a knife now. Her laugh, he could almost hear it again. And Sophie. Sophie's face bright and open, trusting, carefree. They'd promised always friends forever, hadn't they? Silly, childish words. But at the time, they'd meant everything. Alex closed his eyes for a second and felt something sharp twist in his chest. He hated her. He had to hate her, didn't he? 2 days later, late evening. The gymnasium was quiet now, the training session over, the locker room almost empty. Sophie sat on the bench, toweling her hair dry, exhausted but satisfied after a tough practice session. Her muscles ached pleasantly. She'd won every match that evening, moving with precision and calm, even as she felt the whispers still swirling around her. But here, in this space, she felt like herself again. Strong, capable, in control. Until he appeared. Alex stood in the doorway, leaning lazily against the frame, arms folded. His gaze sharp, assessing. There was no crowd this time, just him and her. "You should quit while you can, Bennett," he said smoothly, his voice low but clear. "You're not wanted here." Sophie didn't look up at first. She kept folding her towel carefully, as though his presence was an irritation, but nothing more. When she did meet his gaze, her eyes were calm, steady. "You're wasting your breath, Sterling," she replied evenly. "I've survived far worse than you." His smile didn't reach his eyes. He took a step forward, then another. Crossing into her space, he stopped just close enough that she could feel the tension between them, that strange, sharp electricity that neither of them wanted but couldn't quite ignore. "You think you're tough now?" he said quietly, his tone soft but dangerous. "But I know the real you, the little girl who cried when her dad left, who begged me to forgive her. You haven't changed. I'll make sure everyone sees that." For a second, just a heartbeat, Sophie's eyes flashed with something raw. Pain. Real pain. But then she straightened up, shoulders set, gaze hardening. "You don't know me anymore," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And if you did, you wouldn't like what I've become." The air between them seemed to tighten. Alex's gaze lingered on her face, that same face he'd known for so long, but changed now, sharper, older, colder. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his expression. Attraction? Regret? Neither of them would name it. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled back. His smirk returned. Polished, cruel. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. You won't last the term. He turned and left, the sound of the locker room door slamming behind him, echoing in the empty space. Sophie sat perfectly still for a moment, staring at the closed door. Her heart was racing again, not with fear, but with something more complicated. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophie felt the weight of the rumor dragging behind her like a shadow as she crossed the campus the next day. The story Alex had planted was mutating, spreading, twisting until she could feel it in every stare, every whispered conversation that stopped as she passed. In the lecture halls, students shifted away from her as though her presence were a scandal they could catch. In the library, even the librarians watched her too closely. In the common rooms, girls glared, boys smirked. Everywhere, her name floated on poisoned tongues. But Sophie refused to react. When the tennis coach announced the team for the upcoming high-profile match, Sophie's name should have been there. She'd earned her place with skill, discipline, and focus. But when the list went up on the notice board, her name was missing. The coach caught her eye and gave a tight smile. "Team image concerns," he said vaguely before turning away. It was a lie. She knew exactly whose influence was behind it. Alex Sterling. Inside, it hurt more than she would admit, not just because it was unfair, but because it was clear this wasn't about humiliation anymore. Alex wanted to break her spirit completely. By evening, even the tennis courts felt colder. Every encounter with him, accidental or otherwise, had become its own private battle. Hostile glances in corridors, cutting remarks as they passed, heavy silences thick with unresolved history, and something else, darker, simmering beneath the surface. When the invitation to the Founders Masquerade Ball arrived, Sophie wanted nothing more than to ignore it. But attendance was compulsory for scholarship students. She had no choice. The grand ballroom glittered with gold chandeliers and polished marble, every detail reeking of privilege and entitlement. Masks concealed faces, but not status. The air was heavy with laughter, gossip, and wine. Sophie stood alone by the edge of the dance floor, her mask simple and plain, feeling like an intruder. Then, without warning, Alex was there. His mask was dark and elegant, but she would have known him anywhere. The way he carried himself, the way the room's energy shifted when he moved. He offered his hand without a word, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Before she could refuse, he spoke low and cold, his breath brushing her ear. "Dance with me, Bennett. Don't make a scene." With the whole room watching, she accepted. His grip on her waist was too firm, his fingers curling possessively, his steps deliberate as they moved across the floor. Every movement was control, every glance a test. "Do you feel small now, Bennett?" he whispered, voice cruel, but quiet enough that only she could hear. But as they moved, as their bodies aligned, despite their loathing, something shifted. The heat of proximity, the tension in their locked gaze, hatred was still there, sharp and cold, but beneath it simmered something neither of them wanted to admit. Sophie's pulse quickened against her will, and Alex's hold softened almost imperceptibly before he caught himself and hardened again. When the dance ended, they stepped apart quickly, masks still in place, history crackling between them. Days later, the cracks in Sophie's exterior finally showed. A call from Maggie. Oliver was seriously ill. Claudia and Richard were nowhere to be found. Sophie was desperate, trapped. She had no funds to leave immediately, no way to abandon her scholarship without sacrificing her future. On campus, Alex noticed the change instantly. She was distant, distracted. Her usually perfect posture bowed ever so slightly as she hurried through corridors. Then he saw her rushing away from the library in tears. It rattled him. That evening, he followed her,
Curiosity overriding anger, he found her in a quiet courtyard, sitting alone, her face pale and exhausted. Without thinking, he approached. "You're still weak, Bennett, even now," he said coldly, but the words felt wrong in his mouth, his tone softer than usual.
Sophie lifted her head, eyes red but burning. "You know nothing about me," she snapped. And for the first time, he hesitated. Her pain was raw, real, and something inside him cracked. But still he retreated, hiding behind a mask of indifference, even as doubt crept into his mind. Vicky Kensington seized the moment. Emboldened by Sophie's apparent fragility, Vicky escalated her attacks, spreading vicious rumors that Sophie's father had secretly bought her place at Sterling University. At the campus cafe, she said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sophie Bennett, here because her father begged and paid, not because she belongs." The humiliation cut deep. Sophie stayed silent, but inside she was breaking. Alex watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He did nothing to stop Vicky, but his silence was no longer simple cruelty. It was conflict. A few days later, he cornered Sophie in a private study room. "Why did you lie that night, Bennett?" he demanded suddenly, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Why destroy both our families? Why ruin my mother's last final days?" Sophie froze, shocked by the rawness in his voice. "I didn't lie," she said finally, her voice low, trembling but firm. "You think you know what happened, but you don't." For the first time, Alex's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and a hint of grief. "You don't understand what I lost," he said quietly. "And you don't understand what I lived through after that night," Sophie replied, her own pain rising to the surface. For a moment, they stood there, the air thick with sorrow and history, both of them speaking harshly, but for the first time, truly hearing each other. That night, something between them shifted irreversibly. 2 days later, Sophie sat alone at the tennis courts after training, exhausted, her mind weary from fighting. Alex appeared again, but this time, he simply sat beside her, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, not cold, just quiet. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice soft. "You don't know what I went through after that night." Alex's reply was just as quiet. "You don't know what I lost either." Their proximity was charged. When their hands brushed by accident, neither pulled away. And then it happened. Sudden, impulsive. Alex leaned in, his lips brushing hers. It wasn't planned, but the kiss deepened quickly, raw and full of years of hurt and heat. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. "That shouldn't have happened," Sophie whispered. "No," Alex agreed, his voice rough. "It shouldn't." But neither moved for a long moment. The next day, Vicky delivered the final blow. She revealed publicly that Sophie's father had made a large donation to Sterling University, implying Sophie's place had been bought. Humiliated, betrayed, Sophie withdrew completely, blaming Alex, assuming he'd told Vicky. Alex, for the first time, confronted Vicky angrily. But it was too late. Sophie had shut him out. Driven by guilt and doubt, Alex began searching for the truth. In the university archives and his family's records, he found what he never expected. Sophie hadn't lied. Her accusation all those years ago had been true. Adults had twisted what happened for their own reasons, turning Alex against her. The guilt hit him hard. Finally, on a windy evening, he found Sophie sitting alone at the old cliffside overlook where they used to go as children. He sat beside her slowly. "You didn't lie," he said softly. "I know now. I failed you. I failed us."
Sophie's walls finally crumbled. Tears spilled as she whispered, "I hated you, Alex, but I never stopped missing who you were." Alex reached for her hand gently. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, but I want to try. I want us to try." Sophie nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his. No grand declarations, no rush, but a beginning. At last. A future built slowly, carefully, honestly. Together. This is the journey of Sophie and Alex, a journey from shared childhood to bitter hatred, from betrayal to redemption, from cruelty to redemption. Sometimes the deepest scars lead us back to the people we can't forget. For more gripping stories of love, betrayal, and redemption, subscribe and follow, and let these characters show you that even the coldest hearts can find their way back to warmth.